Okay, welcome back to the second lecture on the 1920s. Mr. King here. Hope you guys enjoyed the first lecture, and I hope you guys are going to enjoy our brief study of the 1920s, an exciting decade, and we'll try to make some sense, put it into focus for you guys as we move forward before we get into some topics that we'll discuss and you guys will research more in depth. So last time I believe we ended with the idea of women and the sort of emancipation or liberation of women from their traditional roles, having obtained the vote in 1920 with the passage of the 19th Amendment. And I just want to read a quick passage from a work of history that talks about women in the 1920s, and I think it kind of sums up and captures it quite well. So here goes. And I quote, "It was the age of the uncorseted flapper," and you see those flappers in the picture there, "with her dress above her knees, a cigarette in one hand, and a flask of bootleg whiskey or gin in the other. Above all, it was the jazz age, when white millionaires, factory hands, gangsters, professors, debutantes crammed into nightclubs in New York, Chicago, Kansas City to witness the genius of black performers like Duke Ellington, Louis Armstrong, etc." End quote. So I think that really does capture the idea that women are dressing and behaving in new ways. Smoking cigarettes in public, of course, does not seem like anything that would be scandalous today, but it certainly was back then. Drinking whiskey, bootleg whiskey or gin in these dance clubs or speakeasies that I mentioned the last time. And speakeasies was just a code name for bars, and of course bars were not allowed to operate in the age of Prohibition. So really an exciting time for women, and of course the traditional roles that women had played were coming under sort of revision. Women out working, out socializing without the presence of chaperones. And again, that's got to be an awfully weird concept for us today to think that women, unmarried women, out on their own or out on the town without a male chaperone. But those were very much holdovers from the 19th century idea of how women ought to behave in public places. And you can think of maybe some other places in the world today where women are still really kind of wrapped up in these strict codes of behavior, if you will. So they're still there in some societies today, in particular some of the more traditional societies of the Middle East or Afghanistan, for example. So at this point, let's take a brief pause and move forward. And I want to introduce this idea, and this is a big idea, big concept, not only for the 20s, but also for history in general. That's what we're studying. And this is the idea of change in history. That is, some things change over time versus continuity, and that is, some things stay the same. So they're really not difficult words to comprehend, although most people think of history and they think of things continually changing, improving, getting better. So that's sort of this idea that we somehow mistakenly have of history. But the 1920s, I think, is a good decade to really show us, to illustrate the idea that history does include change, and there are patterns of growth, but overall, we can see that some of the past is still present in the 1920s, and there's sort of this struggle, this tug of war. I think that's probably the best way to put it, a tug of war between looking forward to the future and the way that American society organized itself, its beliefs, its attitudes, and behaviors from the past. And so there's this major challenge. And what makes the 20s interesting is it's the first time it really comes to the surface. It's really open. It's visible. And that's going to happen again. I think the next decade really where you see this is the 1960s, a decade that a lot of you probably look forward to studying, and I do too. It's a fun decade, a lot of things going on. So I think there's a lot of similarity and connection between the 1920s and the 1960s. So this idea of change versus continuity is something we want to kind of take up. And we're going to do that, as we said. Let's look at two examples. The 18th Amendment, the Volstead Act, that was prohibition itself. So here you have the idea of limiting or banning the sale and production of alcohol in order to improve society. Those who drink are likely to be less productive. They won't be good family members. They'll spend money on alcohol consumption, going out to bars and those types of things. So yet the new woman, if you will, really wants to go out, wants to socialize, wants to be able to, if you will, consume alcohol like men and behave like those men after having consumed alcohol. So it's really kind of an interesting juxtaposition. So looking forward to women and being able to behave like that, yet saying, well, no, alcohol consumption is bad, and they actually got an amendment to the Constitution passed. Never something easy to do. That amendment will actually be repealed, overturned by another amendment in 1933 for various reasons that we'll see when we get to the 1930s. But the second area or example of this change versus continuity has something to do with schools and teaching, in particular biology in schools. And the controversy or the issue really revolved around the idea of evolution. And Charles Darwin in 1859 published a major work called The Origin on the Species, in which he posited that human beings had evolved over millions of years, starting out from very simple life forms and moving into more advanced, complex life forms, moving into what we would call our ancestors, that is primates, and gorillas, if you will, monkeys, chimpanzees, and then finally becoming human beings fully. So this took place over millions and millions of years. Darwin had found fossil records on one of his voyages. And so this really threw into question the idea of biblical creation, that God created the world. You can read about this in the book of Genesis, which is both the Hebrew Bible and obviously Christian Bible as well. And so you see that God creates the world in 6 days, and the final day is a day of rest. So many Americans, as you might remember, or if not, are deeply religious, and religion was at the core of the American founding, if you will, going all the way back to the Puritans and the Pilgrims and other religious groups that came here. And so religion is quite important, and it's going to experience sort of a revival as industry grew, as people started to move to big cities with lots of people living together in close proximity. That idea of the small town, the close family unit, moral codes of behavior were kind of lost, sacrificed to the big lights or bright lights of the city. Religion's going to experience this kind of revival in certain areas of the country, in particular the Midwest areas. And there's going to be this major controversy in Tennessee, where the Tennessee state legislature passed a law that made it illegal to teach evolution. That is, in biology class, students were not allowed to learn about evolution, Charles Darwin. They had to, in fact, had to learn about biblical creation in their schools. And that was a Tennessee state law, so it's not a national law, but it reflects, again, that idea of the middle of the country, deeply religious in a very fundamental Pentecostal kind of way. And there was a science teacher in a small town in Tennessee by the name of John Scopes, and he actually set out to teach his biology class about Darwin's evolutionary theories. Of course, he is then arrested on a charge of violating the Tennessee state law, and there's a major trial in which got the attention of the entire nation. So we see again something else in the 1920s, the newspapers. The newspapers loved this stuff. It was big story, big money in terms of increasing circulation. So newspapers sent reporters to this very small town, Dayton, Tennessee, and they covered the trial, and it brought in also outside legal counsel. So both sides, the state of Tennessee and also the lawyer representing John Scopes, were major lawyers of national prominence. So we see the first sort of celebrity trial, and there would be many more celebrity trials in the United States in the 20th and even into the 21st century. And in fact, John Scopes was found guilty of having violated that law. He was charged a minor sum of money. He later then appealed the initial court ruling, the lower court ruling, in a higher court, and it was overturned. But nonetheless, this represents, in my mind, really well this idea of change versus continuity in the 1920s. So you have the existence and the continuation of deeply held religious beliefs that God created the world. The only story that one needed to know, and especially young students, was the biblical story of creation, and that modern science was to be looked upon with a great deal of skepticism and mistrust, actually. So even more than skepticism, mistrust. And that's kind of interesting because the 20th century really is, in many ways, a century of science, major developments in all realms of science, from physics to chemistry to biology, all applied in some ways to medicine, are going to characterize the 20th century. So it's really interesting that right in the 1920s, we have this significant tug of war. And again, that kind of captures what I'm trying to get at in this video lecture, is change and continuity. There's a really wonderful play, Inherit the Wind, that deals with this trial, and there's a film that we're actually going to watch scenes of to give you guys a better understanding of just the passionate nature of this change versus continuity. A lot of times in history class, everything is sort of abstract. Many times students will say, well, I don't really understand. It's hard for me to relate to this. But I think once we begin to look at maybe the play, the literature, and then the film version adaptation, you'll be able to see that more clearly and hear that. So with that, I'm going to end, and again, just repeat. So the 1920s is a time of great newness. I could add one more example to this idea of change versus continuity, and that comes up, and you'll see this in The Great Gatsby, those of you that will read that in your English classes, and that is the idea of debt. That is the idea of borrowing money to purchase things, material things. The United States, up until the 1920s, the people and the culture and the mentality was really anti-debt. That is, having debt is not good. Having debt is a sign of some imperfection, some weakness, that you would rely on others for money to fund your basic daily life and or needs. And so the 1920s is going to really revolutionize that, turn it on its head, and say, look, hey, American people, now you can go out and buy these wonderful new products, from cars to washing machines to radios to vacuum cleaners, all products that we take for granted, frankly, today. But that was something new. And if you didn't have the money to buy these products, you could actually borrow the money from banks and pay it off over time. So the idea of, again, change. Hey, want to buy these latest and greatest and newest products, don't have the money, borrow it and pay it back over time. That was something that was very new. However, there was still a lot of resistance to this, and the idea of debt not being good. And you can hear this in some cases in today's debates about money, about debt. We as a nation have too much debt. Debt is not good. Debt is immoral in some cases, according to some. So this discussion really takes off in the 1920s, and you'll see it in The Great Gatsby, that people borrow money to finance their lifestyles. And I will let you guys enjoy The Great Gatsby without saying much more. So there's a couple of examples of this idea of change and continuity, which is really kind of the big thing in the 1920s. And so I hope that makes sense. If you have any questions, in fact, write those questions down, bring them to class, and with that, we'll end here. Thank you.